They say the strongest man in the room is usually the loudest, but every once in a while, the quietest man walks in carrying something far heavier than confidence. The lobby of Whitmore Strategic Security looked more like the headquarters of a Fortune 500 company than a place that hired bodyguards. Sunlight poured through 40-foot glass windows, reflecting across polished stone floors where rows of former Marines, retired SWAT officers, private contractors, and decorated veterans waited for their names to be called. Expensive watches caught the light. Tailored suits hid powerful frames. Every conversation sounded like a resume spoken out loud. Medals, missions, years overseas. Names of elite units floated through the air like badges that demanded respect before anyone had earned it inside the building. Then the front doors opened again. Nathaniel Cole stepped inside carrying a worn backpack with tiny purple butterflies stitched across one pocket. It looked strangely out of place beside his faded work jacket and inexpensive boots. A little girl's lunchbox peeked from the zipper, forgotten after the morning rush. He paused just long enough to check the time on an old wristwatch before quietly setting the backpack against the wall. He had driven straight from dropping his 9-year-old daughter at a weekend science camp across town. One of the receptionists glanced at the backpack, then at the registration form in his hand. She forced a polite smile, but curiosity lingered in her eyes. Around the waiting area, several applicants noticed him almost immediately. One leaned toward another with a grin that wasn't difficult to read. "Wrong building, buddy. Daycare's 2 blocks over." A few chuckled. Someone else laughed a little louder. Another applicant folded his arms and looked Nathaniel up and down as though evaluating used equipment at a garage sale. Didn't know they were hiring dads between soccer practice and grocery shopping. More laughter rolled across the lobby. Nathaniel heard every word. He simply bent down, zipped the backpack completely closed, brushed invisible dust from one strap, and placed it neatly beneath his chair. His expression never changed. Years had taught him something most people never learned. Pride spent defending itself usually accomplished nothing. Across the building, hidden behind a wall of smart glass overlooking the training floor, Charlotte Whitmore watched the incoming applicants through a bank of security monitors. At 34, the founder and CEO of Whitmore Dynamics had survived boardroom betrayals, public lawsuits, online threats, and more than one frightening security breach. Success had taught her to question everyone, especially those who looked ordinary. The director of security handed her another file. Former special operations. Another one with executive protection experience. She nodded without much interest until one camera caught the man with the butterfly backpack quietly taking his seat while the room laughed around him. He never answered back, never rolled his eyes, never challenged anyone. Charlotte leaned slightly closer to the monitor. "That's unusual," she murmured. The security director barely looked up from his clipboard. "Which one?" "The quiet father. He doesn't seem interested in proving anything." The director glanced at the screen and shrugged. "Sometimes that's because they can't." Charlotte didn't respond. Something about Nathaniel's stillness refused to blend into the background. In a room full of men trying desperately to look dangerous, he looked completely at peace, and somehow, that made him impossible to ignore. The first physical evaluation began exactly at 8 o'clock. A sharp whistle echoed through the training complex, cutting every conversation short. Applicants formed neat lines beneath enormous American flags hanging from the steel rafters above. The room smelled faintly of fresh rubber flooring, machine oil, and strong coffee. On the far wall, a digital screen displayed the day's schedule. Endurance, observation, decision-making, protective response, team coordination. There was no mention of fighting. That surprised more than a few applicants. Nathaniel quietly joined the last line without looking around. He adjusted the cuff of his faded jacket before removing it and folding it carefully across the back of a chair. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost routine. Nothing about him suggested urgency. Nothing invited attention, yet people kept watching him anyway. The first event looked simple enough. A timed obstacle course stretched across the training floor with climbing walls, weighted sleds, balance beams, and sprint intervals. Several competitors exploded forward as soon as the signal sounded. Boots pounded across the floor. Heavy breathing filled the room. Every obstacle became another opportunity to impress the observers standing behind the glass. Nathaniel started several seconds later than everyone else. He never rushed. He never wasted a step. His breathing remained steady from beginning to end. When others attacked each obstacle with raw force, he relied on balance and rhythm. He finished well behind the fastest competitors, placing somewhere near the middle of the scoreboard. The comments started almost immediately. One former contractor laughed while wiping sweat from his forehead. Guess the school pickup schedule slowed him down. Another competitor shook his head. He moves like somebody trying not to spill coffee. A third applicant smiled toward the others. At least he finished. The room filled with scattered laughter again. Nathaniel heard it all. He simply accepted a bottle of water from an assistant, thanked her politely, and stepped aside without saying another word. Behind the observation glass, Charlotte Whitmore studied the results on her tablet. The security director crossed his arms confidently. Middle of the pack. Average endurance. Average speed. Probably gone before lunch. Charlotte kept reading without answering. Instead of looking at the rankings, she requested another screen. Replay camera 7. The footage rolled backward. Nathaniel crossing the balance section. Nathaniel lifting the sled. Nathaniel slowing before every blind corner. She watched twice before speaking. He never wasted energy correcting mistakes because he never made unnecessary mistakes. The director frowned slightly. You can learn efficiency. You cannot teach speed. Charlotte tilted her head. Perhaps, but speed usually gets people noticed. Discipline keeps them alive. Down on the training floor. The next assessment focused on awareness instead of strength. Instructors quietly rearranged backpacks, identification badges, water bottles, and equipment cases while the applicants waited outside the room. Minutes later, everyone was brought back inside and handed a blank sheet of paper. List every change you noticed. Groans spread across the room. Some rushed to write. Others stared helplessly at the walls. Nathaniel lowered his eyes for only a moment before calmly filling the page line by line. He did not hurry. He did not erase a single word. When time expired, the lead evaluator collected every sheet with an unreadable expression. Several minutes later, he looked up from Nathaniel's paper and raised one eyebrow. Interesting. Very interesting. Charlotte noticed the subtle reaction immediately. She did not ask how many answers Nathaniel had gotten right. She asked a different question entirely. What was the one thing he noticed that everyone else missed? The evaluator smiled almost to himself before quietly holding up Nathaniel's page. At the very bottom, beneath every listed object, one final sentence had been written in careful handwriting. The emergency exit nearest the lobby cannot open completely because the floor hinge drags against the frame. The room grew noticeably quieter after the written evaluations were collected. Confidence had filled the air all morning, but confidence had a way of shrinking whenever people realized the competition was measuring something deeper than muscles and polished resumes. The lead evaluator stepped to the center of the training floor with a clipboard tucked beneath one arm. He scanned the room before speaking in an even voice. Executive protection is not about winning fights. It is about preventing them. If your client is forced into one, you have already failed somewhere earlier. Several applicants exchanged doubtful glances. They had expected demonstrations of strength, not lessons in restraint. Nathaniel remained exactly where he was, one hand resting lightly against the back of his chair while his eyes stayed fixed on the instructor. Charlotte watched the exchange through the observation glass, saying nothing. She noticed how the loudest applicants had slowly become the least patient. Every delay seemed to irritate them. Every unexpected exercise chipped away at their confidence. The security director handed her another folder. There is one candidate everyone has been talking about all morning. Charlotte opened the file. Evan Cross, former professional mixed martial arts champion. Multiple executive protection contracts. Nationally recognized instructor. She looked toward the training floor as a broad-shouldered man confidently stepped forward, smiling as though he already expected an offer by the end of the day. He greeted instructors by name. Several evaluators returned friendly nods. It was obvious he had earned a reputation long before arriving. A few applicants whispered with admiration. Others quietly accepted that they were probably competing for second place. Evan noticed Nathaniel standing alone near the water station. His smile widened. He walked over casually, carrying the relaxed confidence of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. First time doing executive protection? Nathaniel looked up politely. First time interviewing for this company. Evan nodded slowly. You seem like a decent guy, but these jobs are different. Clients pay for certainty. They do not hire fathers looking for a career change. Several nearby applicants chuckled. Nathaniel simply answered, "I understand." Evan tilted his head, almost disappointed that no argument came back. "Well, good luck anyway. You are going to need plenty of it." Before Nathaniel could reply, another whistle echoed across the room. Every applicant turned toward the main training mat where instructors had assembled padded barriers, office furniture, and narrow walking lanes designed to resemble a crowded corporate hallway. The lead evaluator addressed the group once again. "The next exercise will test judgment under pressure. There will be no winners based on strength alone. Think before you move." The room buzzed with curiosity. One applicant finally raised his hand. "Are we working in teams?" The evaluator smiled faintly. "Not exactly." He glanced toward the observation room. "Miss Whitmore would like one additional assessment before lunch." Charlotte stepped into view behind the glass wall for the first time that morning. Conversation stopped instantly. Her calm expression revealed nothing, yet her presence alone changed the atmosphere. She pressed a small button beside the microphone. "I have reviewed your performances. Some of you are exactly what your resumes promised. Others have surprised me." She paused just long enough for the silence to settle across the room. Then she continued, "There is one final demonstration before we break. A practical evaluation. Nothing elaborate. Just an opportunity to show how you respond when another person challenges your control." Eyes immediately shifted toward Evan Cross. He smiled with quiet confidence. Then Charlotte looked down at the roster in her hand. Her voice remained steady. "Mr. Nathaniel Cole, Mr. Evan Cross, please step onto the training floor together." The training floor fell completely silent as Nathaniel Cole and Evan Cross walked toward the center mat from opposite sides of the room. No cheering. No laughter. Even the applicants who had mocked Nathaniel earlier leaned forward with folded arms, eager to watch what they believed would be a short demonstration. An instructor stepped between them, holding up both hands. "This is a controlled evaluation. The objective is not to overpower your partner. The objective is to demonstrate judgment, awareness, restraint, and control. The exercise ends the moment one participant clearly establishes a safe advantage." "Understood." Both men answered with a calm yes. The instructor stepped away. Evan smiled politely. "You seem like a good man, Nathaniel. I hope you do not take this personally." Nathaniel returned a small nod. "I never do." A soft tone echoed through the room, signaling the beginning. Evan moved first. Not recklessly, not aggressively. He circled with measured confidence, testing distance the way an experienced professional always did. Nathaniel adjusted one step backward. Nothing more. His hands remained relaxed. His breathing never changed. Several applicants exchanged amused looks. "Is he even going to do anything?" One whispered. Another shook his head. "He is frozen." Charlotte Whitmore continued watching from behind the observation glass, without speaking. She noticed something everyone else seemed to miss. Nathaniel was not watching Evan's hands. His eyes drifted lower, studying shoulders, hips, feet, and balance, almost as though he were reading a language invisible to everyone else. Evan shifted direction, closing the distance with another careful advance. Nathaniel quietly moved aside, leaving only inches between them before resetting his position. The movement looked almost effortless. No wasted motion. No panic. No unnecessary speed. The instructor glanced down at his stopwatch before looking back up again. Interesting. Evan increased the pace slightly, changing angles with smooth precision. Nathaniel answered every adjustment with another calm step, allowing space to appear where moments earlier there had been none. It felt less like watching two competitors and more like watching one man solve a problem that kept changing shape. Murmurs spread across the room. "Why is Cross unable to corner him?" somebody quietly asked. The security director folded his arms tighter. He had noticed the same thing. Nathaniel was never reacting late. He was moving before situations fully developed, quietly denying every opportunity without appearing hurried. Charlotte leaned closer to the glass. She had seen similar discipline only once before during a federal security briefing years earlier. It was not athletic instinct. It was trained observation. Then everything changed in a single moment. Evan attempted one final controlled engagement designed to force Nathaniel into an obvious mistake. Instead of retreating again, Nathaniel stepped forward by less than a foot. His timing was almost impossible to notice. One gentle redirection. One careful adjustment of balance. One calm movement that lasted no longer than a heartbeat. Evan stopped, blinked once in surprise, and realized he could no longer continue the exchange without losing complete positional control. Before anyone understood what had happened, the instructor raised his hand. Enough. The evaluation is complete. Silence swallowed the room. Evan looked down, then back at Nathaniel, with genuine disbelief rather than embarrassment. Slowly, he gave a respectful smile and extended his hand. I have not been outpositioned that cleanly in a very long time. Nathaniel accepted the handshake without celebration. You gave me a difficult problem to solve. Thank you. Nobody applauded. Nobody laughed. They simply stared. The room had expected strength to decide the outcome. Instead, patience, awareness, and quiet discipline had changed everything. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The silence felt heavier than applause ever could. The applicants who had spent the morning comparing credentials now looked at Nathaniel with entirely different eyes. The confidence that had filled the room earlier had quietly dissolved into curiosity. Evan Cross released the handshake and took one slow step backward. There was no frustration on his face, only respect. He looked toward the evaluators and gave a slight nod. I understand the lesson now, he said calmly. The strongest protector is not always the strongest fighter. The lead evaluator closed his clipboard with a quiet snap. Exactly. Several applicants lowered their eyes. They had mistaken restraint for weakness. Charlotte Whitmore stepped away from the observation window for the first time that morning. Her heels echoed softly through the executive hallway as she entered a private conference room overlooking the training center. The security director followed a few seconds later carrying the updated evaluation files. He placed Nathaniel's folder on the table beside the others. Charlotte opened it without speaking. Former diplomatic security service contractor. Multiple overseas assignments. Advanced protective surveillance certification. Emergency evacuation specialist. Medical response training. She slowly turned another page. Then another. Finally, she stopped. Why was this not highlighted during registration? The director adjusted his glasses. Because he never mentioned any of it. The credentials were verified through background screening after he submitted his application. Charlotte looked back toward the training floor below. He allowed everyone to assume he was inexperienced. The director nodded. Apparently so. She remained quiet for several moments before asking another question. Has anyone spoken with him about his employment history? A human resources coordinator answered from across the room. Only briefly. He left executive protection several years ago and accepted maintenance work for a local school district. Charlotte looked genuinely puzzled. That is an unusual career change. The coordinator hesitated before answering. According to his file, the school schedule allowed him to raise his daughter without depending on babysitters. The room became unexpectedly quiet. Charlotte closed the folder halfway. Around the training floor, applicants slowly dispersed for the scheduled lunch break. Conversations sounded different now. Nobody joked about Nathaniel's faded jacket anymore. Nobody mentioned the butterfly backpack. One applicant quietly admitted, I never even noticed how carefully he watched every room before walking into it. Another answered, I did. I just thought he was nervous. Evan overheard them while filling a paper cup with coffee. He smiled to himself. No, he was making sure all of us felt safe before we even realized he was doing it. Across the cafeteria, Nathaniel sat alone near the window eating a simple turkey sandwich from a reusable lunch container. Beside it rested a folded sheet of construction paper covered in colorful markers. He opened it carefully before taking another bite. Inside was a handwritten note from his daughter. Good luck today, Daddy. Remember to smile because you always smile when I get nervous. A small drawing showed the two of them standing beneath a bright blue sky holding hands. Nathaniel looked at the picture for several quiet seconds before folding it with the same care someone might give a priceless photograph. High above the cafeteria, Charlotte happened to glance through the glass railing at exactly that moment. She had expected to find an applicant celebrating an impressive performance. Instead, she saw a father quietly smiling at a child's drawing, completely unaware that anyone was watching. After lunch, the applicants were escorted to a quieter section of the facility where polished conference rooms overlooked the city skyline. The atmosphere had changed. The laughter from the morning had disappeared, replaced by careful conversations and thoughtful silence. Nathaniel waited outside interview room 3 with the same quiet patience he had shown all day. He sat upright, hands resting loosely on his knees, while the butterfly backpack remained beside his chair. Every few minutes he glanced at the old wristwatch on his arm. calculating how much time remained before he needed to call his daughter after camp. Across the hallway, Charlotte Whitmore reviewed one final page in his file before pressing the intercom. "Mr. Cole, please come in." Nathaniel entered the room with an easy smile. "Afternoon, ma'am." Charlotte motioned toward the chair across from her. "Thank you for waiting." She noticed that before sitting down, he quietly placed the backpack beside his chair instead of leaving it near the door. It was a small gesture, yet somehow deliberate. She opened the conversation without looking at the papers. "You surprised everyone today." Nathaniel answered honestly. "I was only trying to do my best." She studied his expression for signs of pride. There were none. Most applicants would have mentioned their previous assignments the moment they walked through the front door. "You never did." He shrugged gently. "My paperwork speaks for itself. If it does not, talking about it probably will not help." Charlotte leaned back slightly. "You spent years protecting diplomats, corporate executives, and government officials. Why leave that career?" Nathaniel looked toward the afternoon sunlight resting across the conference table before answering. "Because my daughter was learning to recognize my voice through phone calls instead of dinner conversations." The room became still. Charlotte had expected an explanation about stress or salary. She had not expected that. Nathaniel continued quietly. "One day she asked whether I could attend her school science fair. I told her I would try. Then my flight was delayed, the assignment changed, and I missed it. She smiled anyway when I apologized. That was the hardest part." She smiled because she had already become used to disappointment. I promised myself she would never have to get used to it again. Charlotte lowered her eyes to the file resting in front of her. "You accepted maintenance work because it gave you evenings and weekends with her." He nodded once. "It paid less, but it gave me something I could never earn back later. Time." Charlotte remained silent for several seconds. The answer settled somewhere deeper than she expected. Finally, she asked the question that had stayed with her since the training exercise. "During your evaluation with Mr. Cross, why did you wait so long before ending it?" Nathaniel smiled faintly. "Because people reveal themselves when they believe they have more time. Rushing only teaches you how fast someone can move. Patience teaches you who they are." Charlotte looked at him without speaking. For the first time in years, an applicant had answered every question without trying to impress her. He was not selling confidence. He was simply telling the truth. As Nathaniel's phone vibrated softly on the table, he glanced at the screen and immediately silenced it without checking the message. Charlotte noticed the wallpaper reflected briefly across the black glass. The same smiling little girl standing beside him beneath a bright blue sky. Nathaniel looked almost embarrassed. "I am sorry, ma'am. That is probably my daughter letting me know she won another ribbon at science camp. I told her I would call as soon as I was finished here." Charlotte looked at the silent phone for a long moment before quietly closing his file. Charlotte stood beside the conference room window long after Nathaniel had left. The city stretched across the afternoon horizon, alive with traffic, deadlines, and people rushing toward places they believed mattered. Yet her attention remained on the quiet man walking through the lobby below with a faded backpack resting comfortably over one shoulder. The security director stepped into the room carrying the final evaluation sheets. He smiled with quiet confidence. "I believe we have our answer." Charlotte did not immediately respond. Instead, she asked a question that surprised him. "How many applicants tried to convince us they were the best today?" He looked over the reports. "Nearly all of them." "And how many tried to convince us they were trustworthy?" The director paused before slowly answering. "Only one." Charlotte closed the folder. "Schedule one final assessment before we make an offer." The director frowned slightly. "Another interview?" She shook her head. "A real assignment." 2 hours later, a convoy of black sport utility vehicles rolled beneath the covered entrance of Whitmore Dynamics headquarters. Charlotte was scheduled to attend a private technology partnership meeting across town, a routine appearance that had been planned for weeks. Normally, only established members of her executive protection team would participate. This afternoon would be different. The senior protection supervisor looked uncertain as Charlotte gave her instructions. Nathaniel Cole joins the detail. Immediate effect. Several experienced agents exchanged puzzled glances. One quietly objected. "Ma'am, he has not completed onboarding. We have applicants with years of experience already cleared for field assignments." Charlotte remained calm. Experience has never been today's problem. Judgment has. Her tone ended the discussion. Nathaniel was called from the waiting area just as he finished speaking with his daughter on the phone. A warm smile lingered on his face as he slipped the device into his pocket. The supervisor approached with a professional expression. "Mr. Cole, Miss Whitmore would like you to accompany today's executive movement as an observer." Nathaniel nodded politely. "Understood." Within minutes, he found himself standing beside a line of polished vehicles while veteran agents reviewed routes, schedules, alternate entrances, and emergency procedures. Some welcomed him with courteous handshakes. Others barely acknowledged his presence. One agent quietly whispered to another, "He has not even been hired yet." The second answered under his breath, "Apparently someone upstairs already made that decision." Nathaniel pretended not to hear. Instead, he slowly walked around the lead vehicle, checking mirrors, tires, door handles, and the surrounding loading area with calm attention. Nobody had asked him to do it. It simply seemed natural to him. Charlotte exited the building a few moments later wearing a navy business suit, a tablet tucked beneath one arm. Before entering the vehicle, she noticed Nathaniel looking toward the opposite side of the street rather than at the convoy itself. "What do you see?" she asked. Nathaniel answered without taking his eyes away from the intersection. "I see a delivery truck that has been parked in a commercial loading zone for almost 20 minutes without unloading anything." Charlotte looked across the street. It appeared ordinary enough. The supervisor checked his schedule. "That truck is not part of today's logistics plan." Nathaniel finally turned toward them. "Maybe it is nothing. Maybe the driver is simply running late. But when people stop doing what their vehicles were designed to do, I believe it is worth paying attention." Charlotte followed his gaze once more. For reasons she could not explain, she found herself listening very carefully. The convoy remained exactly where it was while the senior protection supervisor quietly contacted building security. Nobody rushed. Nobody raised an alarm. From the sidewalk, it looked like nothing more than a brief delay before another executive meeting. Charlotte appreciated that. Calm protected reputations almost as much as people. Nathaniel continued observing the street with patient focus. His attention drifted from the parked delivery truck to the reflections in nearby office windows, then toward the pedestrians crossing the intersection. Every movement seemed to fit into an invisible pattern only he could see. A few moments later, a uniformed security officer approached the truck and exchanged a short conversation with the driver. After checking paperwork, the officer waved toward the loading entrance on the opposite side of the block. The truck immediately pulled away and disappeared around the corner. The supervisor looked relieved. "False alarm." Nathaniel nodded politely. "I am glad I was wrong." Charlotte looked at him with quiet curiosity. "You do not seem disappointed." He smiled gently. "Being wrong is a good outcome when everyone stays safe." They entered the lead vehicle, and the convoy finally rolled into downtown. Traffic. Afternoon sunlight reflected across rows of glass towers while commuters filled every lane. Inside the vehicle, silence settled naturally. Charlotte reviewed presentation notes on her tablet, while Nathaniel watched the streets outside without appearing tense. He noticed delivery bicycles weaving through traffic, construction crews redirecting pedestrians, and families waiting patiently at crosswalks. Nothing escaped his attention because nothing was too ordinary to matter. 20 minutes later, the convoy reached the conference center hosting the private partnership meeting. Corporate representatives, journalists, and invited guests gathered near the entrance beneath polished steel awnings. The security team smoothly guided Charlotte toward the reception area while maintaining respectful distance from the growing crowd. Nathaniel quietly slowed his pace. Something caught his attention. Near the registration tables stood a temporary decorative display featuring tall floral arrangements secured by lightweight metal stands. One support cable had slipped loose, leaving the display leaning slightly toward the narrow walkway where guests continued to gather. Most people walked past without noticing. Nathaniel stepped toward an event coordinator. "Excuse me, I believe someone could trip if this shifts any farther." The young coordinator looked surprised before immediately calling 2 maintenance workers. Within moments, the display was safely repositioned and the loose cable secured. No headlines. No dramatic rescue. Just a simple problem solved before it became someone else's emergency. Charlotte had watched the entire exchange from several yards away. She waited until the coordinator returned before asking quietly, "Did anyone ask you to check that display?" Nathaniel shook his head. "No, ma'am." "Then why stop?" He answered as though the question required no thought at all. "Because protecting people begins long before they realize they need protection." Charlotte stood silently as those words settled in the afternoon air. Throughout years of executive leadership, she had interviewed candidates who promised courage, confidence, strength, and loyalty. Very few had spoken about preventing ordinary moments from becoming dangerous ones. As the meeting concluded later that afternoon, the senior protection supervisor approached Charlotte with a discreet update. I reviewed Mr. Cole's complete service history during the conference. Every assignment ended the same way. No incidents, no injuries, no public attention. Charlotte looked through the glass doors where Nathaniel was patiently holding the entrance open for an elderly visitor using a walking cane before quietly rejoining the team without expecting acknowledgement. She smiled almost to herself. For the first time that day, she realized she was no longer evaluating whether Nathaniel could protect her. She was wondering how many lives had already been made safer simply because he chose to notice the things everyone else ignored. The return drive unfolded beneath the warm colors of early evening. Long shadows stretched across the streets while the city slowly traded business suits for families heading home. Inside the lead vehicle, the atmosphere felt noticeably different from the morning. Nobody questioned why Nathaniel occupied a seat within the executive protection detail anymore. The conversation over the radios remained calm, professional, and uneventful. For Nathaniel, that was exactly how a successful day should end. When the convoy arrived at Whitmore Dynamics headquarters, Charlotte thanked each member of the team before asking Nathaniel to remain for a few minutes. She led him back to the same conference room where they had spoken earlier. The city lights had begun appearing one window at a time, painting the skyline with quiet reflections. Charlotte placed a single folder on the table between them. I have made my decision, she said. Nathaniel listened without interrupting. I would like to offer you the position of Senior Executive Protection Specialist. Effective immediately. Nathaniel looked at the folder but did not reach for it. Instead, he asked one unexpected question. What would the schedule look like? Charlotte smiled faintly. Most candidates ask about salary first. Nathaniel answered with the same calm honesty that had followed him throughout the day. My daughter has a school concert every Thursday evening. If protecting your schedule means I never see hers, then I should not accept the job. Charlotte rested her hands on the table. Then we will build a schedule that protects both. Good security planning begins with people, not calendars. For the first time that day, Nathaniel allowed himself a genuine smile that reached his eyes. Thank you, ma'am. That means more than you know. Charlotte slid the employment agreement across the table. Welcome to Whitmore Dynamics, Mr. Cole. He signed the final page with steady hands before carefully placing the pen exactly where he had found it. Moments later, his phone vibrated again. This time, Charlotte nodded toward it. Go ahead. Nathaniel answered immediately. A cheerful young voice burst through the speaker. Daddy, I won first place for my bridge design. I knew you would call. His face brightened in a way no interview or job offer ever could. That is wonderful, sweetheart. I cannot wait to hear every detail. Did you remember what we talked about? The little girl laughed. Yes. Thank everyone who helped me. Nathaniel smiled. That is my girl. After ending the call, he quietly slipped the phone into his pocket. Charlotte looked out across the city before speaking almost to herself. I spent years believing the best protector was the person who could respond to the biggest crisis. Today you reminded me that the best protector is the one who notices the smallest one first. Nathaniel stood, picked up the butterfly backpack, and prepared to leave. Before reaching the door, he paused. Kindness works the same way, ma'am. Most people wait for a life-changing moment. Usually, it is the little moments that change a life. Charlotte watched the elevator doors close behind him until his reflection disappeared into the polished steel. Around her, the headquarters looked exactly as it had that morning. The marble floors still gleamed. The lights still reflected across the glass walls. Yet something inside the building had quietly changed. Nobody remembered the laughter that greeted a father carrying a little girl's backpack. They remembered the man who never raised his voice, never demanded respect, and somehow earned all of it simply by protecting people before they even knew they needed someone to care.